There we go. Okay. So in my case, I was working, I'm a little earlier on in the process than what Tracy was just talking about. We're working in the Robert Altman archives with a much sort of smaller program, much further back in the process, and with much less budget. So we're kind of coming at it from a more traditional archival standpoint. So the Robert Altman Archives, this is Mr. Altman here. He was an independent filmmaker. He passed away a few years ago. And a couple years after that, the Special Collections Library at the University of Michigan received his whole personal collection. So it was manuscripts, papers, a lot of audiovisual material, and then also when I came on, I was there to deal with, at the tail end of the processing, which was what was left was anything that was physical digital media that had come in with the collection. So it was sort of several big cardboard boxes when I got there that were just filled with a huge jumbled collection of everything, starting with late 70s, 8-inch floppy disks, going straight through pretty much every media type you can think of right up until some big external hard drives that were only a few years old. And so this was the first time that Special Collections had ingested a digital collection like this. Aside from sort of a disk here and there, this was the first large-scale attempt to deal with this kind of thing for us. So I'm just going to kind of present a case study of what we did. And our basic goals with the project were just to establish any kind of intellectual control over this collection, and then to just begin developing preservation strategies for dealing with it. And in our case, we were interested in the material both as digital content, but also as physical archival objects, which we thought were worth preserving in the context of having the wider archive. They're nice objects. They have personal handwriting. They have people's notes, sometimes even sticky notes attached to them. And it's great just to have the context of knowing where the digital files were coming from. So we started with a great white paper that was put up by OCLC a few years ago, which is called "You've Got to Walk Before You Can Run: First Steps for Managing Foreign Digital Content Received on Physical Media." And in this, I was working with both the archivist for the collection and the digital preservation librarian for M-Library. So we kind of, this little team, we came up with 6 basic questions in pairs that we thought we needed to answer about our collection, which was what we actually had, what condition it was in, and then the hardware and software for preserving the pure bit stream of the files, and then possibly our future goal of opening the files in a readable format. And then steps to ensure long-term preservation, in our case, both of the digital content and of the physical media. So answering what was in the collection was pretty simple. We just put together an inventory, but we did confer on exactly what we wanted to know about each piece of information. So we gave everything a unique identifier, and then we took down any label information. Unfortunately, because Mr. Altman had passed away before we got his media, and because it became apparent once we started working that some of these things had been sitting in boxes for quite a long time before that with nobody touching them, we didn't have the option of kind of going back and asking for clarification. So we're just trying to reconstruct metadata for the collection based on things like labels, some of which are falling off, things like that. So we did take down titles whenever we could. And then we wrote out each media type and its maximum capacity, which became, at the end, we were able to add all the maximum capacities together and come up with a rough estimate for what kind of size of a collection we were dealing with as far as memory space. We included notes on the preservation, the physical preservation of the objects, and any notes on boxes that they came in to preserve their context. And then the last column with the bright colors there was just for local to us, and we worked with the people that had processed the physical portions of the collection, trying to determine whether there was any kind of paper duplication between the content on the digital media and the content in the physical archives. And the pattern there was that it seemed, from what we could glean from comparing labels on the media and the physical collection, it seemed that early on, when things were on floppy disks on very small memory capacity, that the tendency was to print absolutely everything out. So we had most of that already on paper, but as memory capacity got larger and home computers became more common, the tendency became to work with the things purely as digital files, in which case we had a lot of unique content from later on. And generally we had a very good collection. It was in really good condition. Our worst offenders were the 3.5-inch floppy disks. Those little metal sliders are just really prone to all kinds of issues. You can see the one in the picture is just completely detached. We also found ones that were bent, that were rusting, all kinds of issues that are going to affect actually being able to read information off the disk. And then our culprit on the other side is sort of the traditional archival problem of rubber bands. Somebody really well-meaning in our collection, I'm sure, had rubber banded several disks together probably a couple of decades ago and then never touched the rubber bands, which are now cement, and they are never coming off of the disks. So that's also going to affect being able to put the disk into a reader later on. So at the end of the project, it was about 800 physical items, about 632 of which we actually inventoried. The other 150 to 200 were commercial software that, from as far as we could tell, nobody from the Altman staff or production companies had ever done any alteration on. And we did keep those, but we didn't inventory them. We put them in separations. The total memory size was just over 1 terabyte. But what we discovered is something that I think is going to be true of a lot of these collections as we get more of them in the future, which is that the objects that were the largest in number of physical objects were definitely not the objects that were the largest in terms of memory space in the collection. So we had 12 different types of media in the collection, and you can see our fancy graph there. The outer ring is the collection by object, and the inner ring is the collection by memory space. So that huge yellow portion of the outer ring is 3.5-inch floppy disks, which there were almost 500 of. So it was over 3/4 of the collection. As you can tell, on the inner ring, the memory space, that yellow line is so small you pretty much can't see it. Because each object was just so small in and of itself, they didn't add up to much of anything. The red is, in the inner ring, is the external hard drives. There were only 3 of them, but they were about 3/4 of the memory space of the collection. So working from our perspective, where we were also interested in physical preservation, it kind of presents a little bit of a dilemma when we have a really limited budget and limited staff time. The things that need the most attention as far as physical preservation are not the things that are going to get us the farthest as far as digital preservation and information space. So we kind of had to decide how we were going to balance that out. So we'd answer the first 2 questions with the inventory and the sort of basic level preservation survey, and we moved on to worrying about long-term preservation of the physical and the digital. In our case, we had pretty much no budget. We had this little bit of staff time, and that was, for the most part, that was it. So physical preservation became even more important because we knew we weren't going to be able to actually pull the information off of the media anytime soon. So we did a lot of looking into the best way to organize and rehouse the media, and this is where I just ran into a serious lack of information. I couldn't really find anything reliable as far as large-scale studies of the best physical housing for digital media over time. We know that all the basic preservation issues that are true of physical collections are true of digital physical objects, like water and sun and high and low temperatures being issues. So a couple of things I read also mentioned dust as a particular problem for floppy disks, and of course any kind of magnetics at all, including down to the little magnets that hold cabinet doors closed. So we were really careful about those things, but since you can see that picture a little before and after things, you can see that it came in pretty rough shape, some of it, so we really wanted to give it the best chance of long-term preservation that we could. And so I did a lot of trolling through different computer supply websites, archival company catalogs, and found that nobody at all makes archival quality housing for floppy disks. So we actually kind of took a little step backwards technologically, and we bought microfiche envelopes. And those fit the 3.5-inch floppy disks really well. Anything older than that tended to have come in its own hard case. And anything newer than that did also, but the 3.5-inch floppy disks were that sort of, not sweet spot, a bad spot where they didn't seem to be coming in anything. So we made the choice to buy some envelopes, and we rehoused them all, put them in record center boxes, and left them in nice archival storage, and felt that that was sort of the best that we could do with the knowledge that we had. Yeah, so as I said, we had 12 media types. They ranged from the 8-inch floppy disks all the way through the external hard drives. And in our case, Mr. Altman was an early adopter, which was good for him, I'm sure, but not very good for us, because we had things, like Tracy mentioned, jazz discs. We had several of those, and they were available commercially for less than a decade and never really had any kind of market penetration. So trying to find drives now that read them is like a needle in a haystack process. Yeah, oh, that's exciting. That's really exciting. Yeah, so, and we knew that each of these is going to need a different kind of hardware to read it, and possibly multiple kinds of software per disk to open readable files. So that's a big challenge. So because we had a really low budget, and we have all these different media types and different hardware and software types, we decided to create priority ratings by media type, so that when we do get some funds, we know where we can direct them to have the biggest impact. And we base these on the difficulty and expense of extracting information from that particular media type generally. And then the last two things that were local to us was how large the memory size of that media type is compared to our collection, and then the likelihood that we had a paper duplication. So we did 3 categories: low, medium, high. And high was generally things that were newer because they were less likely to be duplicated and more likely to be readable on a modern workstation. And then low was the smaller things and the things that were really kind of out there and likely to be really hard to find readers for. And the 8-inch floppy disks, I think you mentioned, I did a lot of trolling around trying to find any kind of 8-inch floppy disk reader, and it was mostly people who had sort of unearthed one in their basement, and now they were trying to sell it on eBay, so it was just like a total crapshoot whether that would even function once you managed to plug it in. So our last 2 questions about preserving bit streams and opening the files in a readable format. I did a lot of reading into projects like the one at the University of Illinois. I was actually going through your website. Cornell and Maryland have both piloted some interesting projects. But for us, because we don't have, it wasn't a library-wide, large-scale setup, we were looking for something that could be mostly internal to special collections, dealing with these sort of smaller sets of digital media that would come as part of a larger physical collection. So it was hard to find somebody that had done something like that. I did come up with an idea for a sort of dual workstation setup that was based on some pilot projects I had read, where one station would be legacy media and one station would be current and future media. With the legacy computer tower, it does lend itself to the computer museum problem, where you're dealing with possibly unreliable things. But it did seem, I saw a couple of projects that seemed like they had worked, at least in the pilot phase. So it would involve getting legacy software, including different word processors, emulations of several different legacy operating systems. Hopefully, if you were really lucky, you could find working jazz drives and zip drives. And then the current and future media station would be equipped with the variety of card readers and USB ports, the write blockers and FireWire to USB adapters and that kind of thing. And hopefully emulations of different operating systems. And the legacy media tower was one of the reasons we decided to keep our commercial software that we came across, because we felt that if we would ever develop this kind of a workstation, it would be an option that we knew we already had copies of things like really early versions of Microsoft Word. I think there was a Lotus program, things like that, that assuming that the disks are still working, we could, in theory, load them onto a legacy tower. And then I don't know if this will be readable in the back. We have not had an opportunity to test this, but I did put together a sample workflow for ingesting the actual content into whatever sort of memory setup they would have had. I included a couple of software recommendations in parentheses, and those were taken from a Society of American Archivists. They had a workshop on digital forensics that had recommended this software, so we just pulled it from that. But it's basically setting up the appropriate write block, which would be different for every media type, inserting the disk in the drive, checksums, disk images, and then hopefully at the end, if you didn't need any of these sort of pass-outs where the disk didn't work, actually normalizing files to preservation format and saving them if possible, much like you guys are doing. Yeah, so at the end of the project, we left it with everything inventoried, organized, and rehoused, but we were not actually able to implement our workstations and workflow ideas due to a sort of lack of budget and staff time. The big challenges for us were the variety of media and the swiftness of change, meaning that legacy options, again, are few and far between. And then a lack of standardized best practices and information in the field as a whole. So we felt that starting to meet those challenges would mean testing these workflows, assembling workstations, and starting to gather more information about both how larger projects work and how things might work at a smaller archive like ours, where it's more integrated with the physical media, and starting to share ideas about best practices and what works and what doesn't. That's all I have. We have some questions for Jonathan? Yes.
On your graphic with the 2 rings,
Yeah.
did you consider a 3rd ring, which would be the importance of the content? Because obviously volume is one aspect. You want to get through as much processing as possible, but to me a 3rd dimension to that would be the importance of the content, and sort of in my experience, inevitably it will be on the hardest media in the collection, because the 3.5 floppies were used so frequently, were used so much. The small file might be something that's valuable. Now, granted, he had worked in a highly visual medium, so maybe not in this case, but did you consider?
We considered that when we were doing the priority ratings. We didn't go sort of granular enough to actually graph it out. And one of the hindrances in that case for us was the number of things, especially with the older media, like the floppy disks, where the labels were vague. They would just say the name of the project and not what the file types were, or they would say backup files. Which, so there would have been a pretty large, I think, chunk of the graph that would have been no information or unable to tell. But we did take it into account sort of in a more general way when we were doing the priority ratings.
Okay.
Well, from one of the online participants, how many copies of the content are retained? You retain the original physical media, the preservation copy, and also an access copy?
So we, at this point, haven't pulled anything off of the media, so we have 1 copy of everything, and that's the original physical object. I think that the vision for the future would be to have an access copy, archived digital copies, and then also keeping the physical media, although in that case it would probably be more just as an archival, visual interest. So we had even discussed whether we would eventually kind of pull out sort of the more visually interesting pieces and eventually discard the majority of the physical media.
What's the content? Is it
What's the
correspondence,
content?
screenplays? What's in there?
It was sort of a smattering of everything as far as we could tell. It was a lot of drafts of screenplays, some correspondence. There were some personal medical records. There was photographs. Most of the audiovisual material was on the actual film and things like that, so it wasn't part of the collection. But there was, I think, one of the more interesting ones, Gary Trudeau, who writes Doonesbury. They were originally collaborating on a television show that never took off. And so we had several things from him that appeared to have maybe artwork on them, or certainly screenplay drafts and correspondence.
How about email?
Email?
Where does that go? His email exchanges with all these people who's
You know, I don't know if there was ever, if we were ever given access to an email archive. There were printed out emails, certainly, but I was not told that there was ever, because I assumed that that would still be not even on physical media. It would just be cloud storage through Google or Yahoo or whoever. But yeah, we were not given access to that as far as I know. Did you have a question?
Makes it easier. Just kind of going off, the idea of knowing the importance of what you're looking at. Is there anyone, like a film student or a specialist like that, who has gone through the collection, or who will be at any point to kind of help you guys navigate what the importance of, a script from a certain film or
Right. Yeah, so I put Gavin Strassel on there, who was a processing assistant, and he worked with a lot of the paper, and he was really helpful in trying to help us parse out what was duplicate. As far as just importance of individual projects to sort of film history, there is a curator of, I'm not sure of his actual title, but one of the librarians that works with the film department is very involved with special collections, and he would certainly be accessible as a resource to help us out if we wanted to pinpoint particular projects. The impression I got was that sort of his highlights weren't necessarily more of a priority than anything else, and that actually some of the projects that were worked on and never got off the ground, there might be less information about, but it might be more important as far as people being interested in studying it.
Thank you.
You're